Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And this is going to be a bit of an unusual episode of the Erickson Report. We're only going to be talking about three different things because I've just got some things that I feel I want to say. All right, so going to be not quite as newsy as it usually is, but we'll see how it works out. In any event, the first thing is that I was actually going to do a big thing about Ukraine, a big thing about it, including going into some of the background of it, including, for example, the divisions within Ukraine itself between an anti-Russian western part of the country, which resents a history of Russian domination of Ukraine, and a largely ethnic Russian eastern part of Ukraine, which for that reason tends to identify more with Russia than it does with Europe. Beyond that, I felt I had to look at the Orange Revolution, at the Euromaidan protests and the resulting Revolution of Dignity, it was called, the Russian seizure of Crimea, the ongoing slow-motion war in eastern Ukraine involving two breakaway provinces. And even after you do all of that, you haven't actually addressed the present-day competing great power claims about the region. Well, it soon became clear that that was all too much for me to do. So I'm going to pass on that, at least for now. Instead, I'm going to make a bold prediction, which by the time you see this, events may have proven that this prediction is disastrously wrong, but still I'm going to make it. I predict that Russia is not going to invade Ukraine, that there will not be war over Ukraine. Because first, frankly, I think that if Putin was actually intending to attack, he would have already done it. The seizure of Crimea came within days after the Revolution of Dignity forced the resignation of the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. In the case of Georgia in 2008, Russian forces invaded within hours of government forces seizing the capital of a pro-Russia breakaway province of South Ossetia. But instead now what we have is this dragged-out posturing and looming presence, but no actual direct action. Rajan Menon, he's the director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities and a senior research fellow at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. He had what I think is a much likelier vision of events than the constantly, oh my God, it's going to be war any moment version. Some of this, he's quoting him, some of this, he said, is Putin saying, we matter as a country, and you can't do in European security whatever you want, pretending that we don't exist. In other words, what he's saying is that Putin is going, we won't be ignored. Our concerns will not just be waved off. Now, so the question then is, could Russia have legitimate security concerns, or at the very least, could they feel they have legitimate security concerns? Well, okay, on February 9th, 1990, then Secretary of State James Baker, in a meeting, told Soviet, as it was then, Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze and President Mikhail Gorbachev, that in exchange for Soviet cooperation in the reunification of Germany, that NATO would not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward, unquote, out of respect for Soviet security concerns. In fact, he apparently said the same thing 3 different ways. Okay, look at this map. Check out this map. You can see it's a map of Europe, okay? And there's this funny purplish line I've drawn through it. The countries in blue are members of NATO. Every one of those blue countries to the east, that is to the right of that line, joined NATO after that not 1 inch eastward promise was made. The pale blue country is Bosnia, and it is in the process of entering NATO. And the green countries are Ukraine and Georgia, and the intent is for them to join NATO. So if you were a Russian government official, could you feel that you had been tricked or lied to? Could you feel that you had security concerns that had been ignored? Would you feel at all threatened by these developments? Now, for the sake of completeness, I'll add that U.S. officials have striven mightily to claim that the not 1 inch eastward didn't actually mean that. It actually only applied to the former East Germany and not anywhere else, which is frankly, I think, is a real stretch. And even at that, doesn't address the fact, doesn't face the fact that the Russians could honestly feel differently. They could honestly feel betrayed. They could honestly feel that NATO has shown it can't be trusted. And despite all the pretty words, is actually not interested in mutual security, but in dominance. Okay, well, given that, then why no invasion? Well, for one thing, because even if Putin intended to, and again, what I maintain is that he doesn't intend to, but even if he did intend to, he would have to know that this would be a hard and bloody undertaking. It wouldn't be like when the Russians rolled into Georgia. Ukraine is nearly 10 times the size of Georgia, and its military is 7 or 8 times bigger. We keep hearing about the 100,000 Russian troops along its border with Ukraine, but the Ukrainian army has 150,000 members, plus another 50 to 100,000 in the Navy, Air Force, and National Guard. And even that doesn't count or allow for the arms and equipment that have been coming in from NATO countries. Now, there are those who say that those numbers are irrelevant because Putin would attack with cruise missiles or others, like stand-back long-range weaponry, which, frankly, I find a thoroughly stupid argument because if that's true, then what's the big deal about the 100,000 troops? And second, if he did that, that would provoke exactly the kind of response from NATO that an actual ground invasion would. And it's not just me that has doubts about this. Ukrainian authorities, for one, they projected calm. President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged Ukrainians not to panic, saying there is no reason to pack your bags. A week ago, Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov told the Ukrainian parliament that as of today, there are no grounds to believe that Russia will invade anytime in the immediate future. Meanwhile, Newsweek reports that several current and former officials from Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. have said that U.S. intelligence of an imminent Russian invasion is being exaggerated. And those people, those officials, present and former officials, apparently include some members of Zelensky's inner circle. In fact, Newsweek says the U.S. intelligence community has itself not come to establish a consensus on whether or not Russia is truly preparing to take on what would be a very intense and bloody military operation. Even U.S. Secretary of War Lloyd Austin has said publicly that we don't know if Putin's actually decided to go to war. And White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki now says the administration will no longer use the word imminently. Well, I maintain that Putin hasn't decided to go to war because he doesn't intend to go to war, and that his real concern is to make the declaration to the West that Russia and its concerns are something which the West must pay attention. It cannot continue to feel ignored, and that he will not invade Ukraine unless. And I'm going to leave you hanging there. If in 2 weeks I have not yet been shown to be a thoroughly lousy prognosticator, I'll go into what the greatest threat of war here really is, except to say as kind of a teaser, as is so often true, it will not be the result of someone or some nation's unforced choice. And while, moving to another topic, we are being prompted to panic over the prospect of war in Ukraine, we are also being prompted to panic over the prospect of war here. On January 22nd, the COVID States Project released the results of a survey of some 23,000 people across the country as to whether it is ever, and they emphasize the word ever in the actual poll, is it ever justifiable to engage in violent protests against the government? 23%, nearly a quarter of Americans, said it's sometimes okay to use violence against the government, with 1 in 10 saying it's justified now. Okay, the thing is, this was an online poll, so it's called a non-probability poll. There's no margin of error. There's no, plus or minus this many percent. However, there have been other more scientific polls in recent months that have found much the same answer. A post-election University of Chicago poll found almost 1 in 10 Americans saying it was justifiable to use force to restore Tweety Pie to power. And this just past December, the Washington Post and University of Maryland together found that 1 in 3 Americans think that violence against the government is sometimes justified. In response to this latest poll, the COVID States Project one, Rachel Kleinfeld of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace expressed concern over the fact that the number of Americans who express support for the idea of violent political protest has doubled over the past decade. Okay? Listen up, people. There are at least 2 good reasons to think that such results as are in these polls are meaningless, and that the panic they generate is more dangerous than the results themselves. One issue, in fact, was raised by COVID States Project co-director David Laser, who said the same thing I always think whenever one of these polls comes out. Quoting him, "We began with the American Revolution, and so we are, in a sense, taught from grade school that at some points in history it is justifiable to engage in violent protest." In fact, personally, I keep thinking that I don't see how any good patriotic American can read the Declaration of Independence and then still say that it is never okay to engage in violence against the established government or the established order. Indeed, shortly after Shays' Rebellion was quashed in 1787, Thomas Jefferson wrote, and I'm quoting, "God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." And there's more to that quote, as the ellipsis reveals. I suggest look up the whole quote. You'll find the whole thing interesting. But the other question about the polls now is even more fundamental. What constitutes violence? What constitutes against the government? What do those terms mean in the context of these polls? Consider the plowshares movement. Okay, these people are Christian pacifists who engage in direct action to promote the vision behind the idea of beating swords into plowshares. One time, they just walked into a factory that is making nose cones for nuclear missiles, found a place where the nose cones are being stored, took out hammers and started beating on the nose cones until it was done, until they were no longer useful. Now the question is this a violent protest? I mean, these people are pacifists, but they used hammers. In fact, when they were arrested, one of the things they were charged with was carrying lethal weapons, the hammers. And they did damage government property. So is this violent? Consider a protest, a nighttime protest, where the march is being lit with tiki torches and people are carrying them. And one of those torches falls. It hits the ground, lights something on fire. Maybe a storefront catches fire. Maybe a car catches fire. Does this make the protest violent? There was property damage, but it was an accident. Consider a Black Lives Matter protest, okay, with people facing off against a line of cops. Somebody in that crowd throws a water bottle that hits a cop. Does that make the demonstration violent? I mean, a crime that is a crime. It is an assault on a cop. It's a crime. But so has that demonstration now become violent because of that? And what about the riots, the so-called riots from the Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd? Almost all of the so-called riots consisted of a small group breaking away from a demonstration or march and committing property damage. Does that make the whole demonstration violent because some small fraction of the people engage in property damage? And against the government, are these protests against the government? I mean, if you ask the plowshares movement people, they will say no. It's not against. It's against government policies that they like Republican form of government. They're not against the government. They're against these policies. Black Lives Matter protesters, very likely, ask them, "Are you protesting against the government?" They'd say, "No, we're protesting police violence. We're protesting a condition." So, are these protests against the government or not? The point is not that there's any one right answer to those questions. The point is how you answer those questions will determine how you answer the question on the poll. which means that these percentages in these polls don't tell us anything. They give us no useful information. In fact, Sean Westwood, a professor of government at Dartmouth, is working on a paper that tries to correct for the errors in measurement that exist when people are asked a vague question like, do you support political violence? Those are errors that he feels overstate American support for and thus the prospect of such violence. The bottom line, if an anti-capitalist like me can use the term, but a bottom line here is that while the changes in percentages over the decade that Rachel Kleinfeld cited, because of those, we can reasonably say that overall support for the hypothetical concept of political violence, however you define it, has increased. But we honestly don't know how much any potential for it has increased, especially when we consider, for all our talk about looming civil war, there is far less political violence in the U.S. today than there was in the 1960s and 70s. From the late 60s to the mid to late 70s, nearly a dozen radical underground groups, such as the Weather Underground and the Puerto Rican nationalist group FALN, set off hundreds of bombs. The first real bombing campaign involved attacks on a dozen buildings around Manhattan between August and November 1969. Bombings by the Weather Underground began early in 1970. By June of that year, then President Tricky Dick Nixon was saying that revolutionary terror represented the single greatest threat to American society. In a single 18-month period spanning 1971 to 1972, the FBI identified and counted 2,500 bombings on American soil. That's nearly 5 a day. As late as 1976, after a series of attacks in San Francisco, an FBI representative called the city the Belfast of North America. Why don't we remember any of this? Well, for one thing, we as Americans tend to have very short memories, and this was nearly 50 years ago. For another, the workers' uprising many of those radicals predicted never came about. And what's more, and probably most importantly, we didn't have things like TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, and a 24-hour news cycle populated by things like faux news to magnify events, even as the context for them gets stripped away. My point here is not that we should be unconcerned, okay? January 6th, which was political violence against the government, it was an attack on elections, on the very structure of government. January 6th disproved the idea of being unconcerned. It's rather that first, in terms of political violence, we have been here before and more. And second, and more important, that's not the real threat we face. The real threat can be found in the words of James Madison, who said in June 1778, quoting here, "I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpation." The threat we face is not that of violent insurrection, but that of silent, and indeed not so silent, in fact, overt encroachments on our right to vote, on the process of conducting elections, on the process of counting votes, on the threats to our right to public protest, to the free press. There is more threat to our future as a reasonably free political society in the restrictions on mail-in voting than in a whole string of Nazi parades. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is far more of a danger than that QAnon shaman guy from the Capitol riot could ever hope to be. No, of course, this doesn't mean that you ignore the violence, or you tolerate the violence, or you excuse the violence. It means keep your cool. Don't let the violence panic you. Like the old song says, carry it on. And always remember the difference between the puppets and the puppet masters, between the useful idiots and the users. And we are taking a break. And we are back. Okay, there's one other thing here I want to talk about today. Here's a tragedy about which you might have heard, but it raises two things I've talked about before with regard to police training and encounters with police. January 27th, I-65 south of Nashville, Tennessee. A state trooper saw a man named Landon Eastep on the shoulder of the road and pulled over to try to get him off the highway. Eastep, according to police, pushed away and produced a box cutter which he refused to put down. Another cop came and tried to de-escalate the situation. More cops arrived until Eastep faced a semicircle of 9 cops, most if not all of them with their guns drawn. After about a half hour of this standoff, Eastep pulled from his pocket what police called a cylindrical object and held it out toward the cops. They shot him. They killed him. Turned out the object was not a gun. Now, first off, I will say that I can't honestly blame the cops for shooting, okay? Look at this picture, okay? This is a freeze frame from a body cam of one of the cops. You can see Eastep is holding out something in his hand toward the cops, kind of like this, okay? I guarantee you that at that moment, every one of those cops thought, and I bet you would think too, oh my God, he's pulled out a gun and he's aiming it. I mean, I figure I would probably think something. I saw that and think, oh my God, he's gonna kill me. So we can argue about, did all 9 of them have to shoot? We can argue that they have to shoot him more than once, which apparently they did. We can ask a bunch of related questions about the intensity of the response, but I can't blame them for the existence of a response. All right, but given that, this is where my questions arise. One, why did they have to shoot him? By which I mean here, why was that their only alternative? We have devoted so little energy, so little research, so few resources to the idea of truly non-lethal weaponry. And no, I don't mean tasers. Those are not non-lethal. Even the company now calls them less lethal or less than lethal, something like that. And besides, tasers really are for closer quarters. Next, one of the cops did try again to, they said, de-escalate things. But the fact is, in a true sense, he didn't. Rather, he avoided further escalation, and it's not the same thing. Remember, this had already gone from 1 cop to 2 cops to 9 cops with guns drawn. It had already escalated. De-escalating would mean, by definition, lowering the tension, not just not raising it further. Now, what that cop was trying to do, in fact, was to convince Eastep to de-escalate, to put the box cutter down and cooperate. Now, he said all kinds of encouraging things, which was good. He said all kinds of encouraging things, said things like, whatever it is, we can work it out. Says, we can get you help. Look, I don't want to die. You don't want to die. Hey, you're not going to jail. All kinds of things like that. And all that's good. But it's a failing. And I think with the training they get, and let me just say, maybe this did happen. I mean, all I can go on is the portions of the video that were released. Maybe in the course of this half hour, this kind of thing did happen. If it did, excellent, but it appears as though it didn't. The thing is, in all that time, the cop never asked a question. He was making flat statements, intended to be reassuring, yes, but they were still flat statements. There was never a thing of, hey, what's going on here? Or, you know, what are you looking for us to do? What was it you would like to happen here? What do you hope is going to come out of this? And if asking questions like that is not part of what they're taught in dealing with these kind of situations, it's a terrible mistake, a terrible shortcoming. Because again, look at this picture. Where is Eastep going to go? Where is he going to do? Unless he is truly so clinically insane as to be divorced from reality, he can't even comprehend the reality around him, he cannot think he's going to shoot his way out of this. He cannot think he's going to fight his way out of this. His option, his only option, in fact, is to hop that guardrail and run like hell, hoping the cops either can't catch him or will decide he's just some vagrant and he's not worth chasing. But he didn't. He stood there not cooperating for a half hour and then pulled out something that the cops could think was a gun. I think we can even determine the critical moment early on that generated everything that followed. Remember, this started when a state trooper spotted Eastep on the side of the highway. According to Dan Aaron, a representative from the Metro Nashville Police Department, Eastep, this is quoting NBC News, as they approached the trooper's car, Eastep pushed away from the officer and produced a box cutter. Now, given that description and everything that followed, especially when combined with his widow's acknowledgement that he was struggling with mental health issues and drug addiction and in fact just relapsed a couple of days earlier, I can't help but think that he was sitting on that highway with that box cutter thinking about suicide and trying to get up the nerve to do it. But as he's approaching the cop's car, he thinks, if I get in the car, there's going to be a lot of hassle for my wife, and they're going to stop me, and I can't allow that. And in the flash, which may not have been in the words, it's, I know what I have to do. In other words, I'm convinced that what we had here was a case of suicide by cop, and it is a very real thing. In fact, a survey of research literature on the topic a few years ago found that by varying estimates, anywhere from 10 to 29% of officer-involved shootings were actually suicide by cop incidents. Consider that Estep stood on that highway for half an hour, just standing there as if waiting. And again, it seems to me that at some point he realized, hey, these cops are not going to shoot me, so he did something to provoke them, make them think he had a gun. Suicide by cop is a real thing. And there are, in fact, training modules, good training modules for cops on just that, including what it is and how to recognize that this is what you're facing and ways of dealing with it. But those sorts of materials don't do a damn bit of good if they are not a routine, by which I mean a required part of police training. So again, I say that part of the whole problem with police violence, probably with part of the whole issue with police violence, with police action, issue of what cops should be doing, of what we should not expect them to have to be doing, and what we should expect them to not be doing. The whole issue involved the way we train police is deeply screwed up and leads to needless violence and needless death. It remains true that we can't deal with the problem of police violence until we deal with the issue of racism in police training and police departments and in the country as a whole. But it is equally true that we can't deal with police violence until we deal with how we are training them to think. All right, I'm going to wrap up here. I still got a minute or two, so I'm going to wrap up here. I've got 3 quick RIPs. I'm just going to do them very quickly. On January 20th, Meatloaf died. He was 74. The cause of death was not released. On January 29th, Howard Hessman, probably best known as Dr. Johnny Fever from WKRP in Cincinnati, he died at the age of 81 from complications from colon surgery. And finally, on January 22nd, and this is the one that hit me the hardest, a man named Thich Nhat Hanh died. He was 95 years old. He died from complications from an earlier stroke. And the truth is, if you don't know who this man was, you owe it to yourself to find out. Anyway, that's it. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks. Until then, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And for now, and as always, peace.